Hi, this is David Bennett with the North Carolina Maritime Museum System. Today we're continuing our multi-part series on North Carolina Fisheries Incorporated and the Great Depression. Today we're covering Part 5, Struggling to Survive, 1937 to 1938. Last time we talked about the first year of operations for the North Carolina Fisheries Incorporated and the many struggles that they had encountered. Unfortunately, things don't get much easier for them. In March 1937, the fisheries launched its first large-scale advertising campaign. Mind you, the fisheries had been in operation since October 1935, and they're just now getting around to a big advertising scheme. This campaign was designed by John Sykes, the general manager and president of the North Carolina Fisheries Incorporated, and he had a lot of background, a lot of experience in public relations and newspapers, and he had a multifaceted advertising campaign that consisted of sales advertising, show cards, stickers. They were putting out a magazine called Carolina Coast that was about the seafood industry and eastern North Carolina. They had radio advertising. They had a Friday morning radio show all about eastern North Carolina, and radio was the television of its day. In response to this advertising campaign, there's a large uptick in the number of orders for frozen fillets. Unfortunately, there weren't enough fish being caught in North Carolina at the time to address this new demand, and they didn't have enough frozen fish in stock to address the demand either. In summer of 1937, the Manio plant permanently closed. This was because in each county where the fisheries had a plant, they had a contract with the counties because the counties provided the land as well as funding for the construction of the plants. And this contract stated that if a plant was not being operated for 6 months or more, then the property went back to the county. In July 1937, Dare County notified the fisheries, stating that the plant in Manio had not been in operation for 6 months, so they're taking it back and they're going to sell it to a wholesale fish firm. This came as a surprise to the fisheries because in June 1937 they thought they had renegotiated their contract, going from 6 months of in operation to 24 months. Unfortunately, the person they had done the negotiations with was not authorized to make any deals, and unfortunately, this had not been related to the staff at the fisheries, and they lost the plant, and it was sold to another firm. And the equipment that was in the plant was going to cost too much to move, so they sold it to the buyer that was taking over the plant, and unfortunately they had sold it at a loss. Then in the summer of 1937, there was a controversy regarding purse nets and trawlers. The state was seriously considering allowing purse nets to be used to catch food fish, and purse nets were simply this really large net that were used to catch fish, particularly in menhaden, North Carolina, which menhaden's an industrial fish. It's not a food fish. And the concern was, for many commercial fishermen, that this net, which was so large and could catch so many fish, was just going to further the problem of overfishing in eastern North Carolina. And many were opposed to the purse net, as well as trawlers. So they went to the fisheries and asked them what their position was. And John Sykes, the president and general manager, said that he was all for purse nets and trawlers. In fact, he was trying to get a trawler for the fisheries. And he stated that the fishing practices in eastern North Carolina were backwards and antiquated, and that they needed to modernize and they needed to emulate the practices of New England. And of course, this was offensive to many of the fishermen in eastern North Carolina, and they thought that Sykes' ideas would only lead to overfishing and the depletion of the commercial fisheries of North Carolina. So this just sort of furthered the divide between the fisheries and the North Carolina Fisheries Incorporated and the fishermen. October 1937, John Sykes resigned as general manager, stating that he didn't think he was cut out for the job. He didn't have enough experience. He didn't have any experience in business, and he didn't have any experience in the commercial fishing industry. Again, his background was in public relations and newspapers. He would have thrived probably as a PR or advertising director for the fisheries, but he was the general manager and president. And so he really encouraged them to find someone better. So November 1st, 1937, they brought Zion Mason on board as the new manager. He had been the assistant manager, and he had a lot of experience in the commercial fishing industry, and he had worked in the wholesale fish business. He had worked for many wholesale fish dealers in eastern North Carolina as well as New York. So on paper, he was really cut out for the job. They also brought Mrs. Morgan in to be the office manager, to take on some of the administrative responsibilities so Zion Mason wouldn't have as much on his plate. And she was also made the treasurer, and the two of them together worked to try and reduce the costs at the fisheries. January 1938, Dr. Herbert Purthurch became the new president. He was the director of the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries Laboratory on Pivers Island in Beaufort, and he had been instrumental in getting the fisheries started, and he was also on the board of directors of the parent company for the North Carolina Fisheries Incorporated, which was the North Carolina Self-Help Cooperative, and he was a well-known entity to the fishermen of eastern North Carolina, and he was known and trusted. Unfortunately, in 1938, the fisheries came to the conclusion that they couldn't compete very well with fresh seafood. It was cheaper for people to obtain fresh seafood, and also people were concerned that the frozen fillets that the fisheries was trying to market, that they wouldn't taste as good as fresh seafood, and they didn't think the quality was going to be as nice, and so they're having to really sort of struggle with this opposition. At this time, frozen foods were relatively new to the scene in America. They weren't widespread and or generally accepted by the public yet at this time. One historian, Shane Hamilton, wrote that prior to the end of World War II, frozen foods were sold at high prices, in low volumes, and in fragmented markets. So before World War II, frozen foods are expensive. Not a whole lot are out there on the market, and they're only really sold in select grocery stores and meat dealers. So getting into the frozen food industry during the Depression was going to be a huge challenge. It would not have been the optimum time. In fact, frozen foods didn't really become really popular until World War II, when there was a tin shortage, and American food producers started to move more towards frozen foods. And by the time of the late 1940s and 50s, frozen foods were really on the rise, along with the expansion of grocery stores. Also in the 1930s, you had some larger frozen food companies, namely the Frosted Foods Company, which is known today as the General Foods Corporation, and they put out the Bird's Eye products, which you'd be familiar with today. They had the Bird's Eye Laboratories, which specialized in experimenting with frozen foods. Clarence Birdseye was basically the father of American frozen foods industry, and he had done a lot of work with frozen seafood, and the Frosted Foods Company was producing some of the best frozen foods and in the highest quantities as well. So it'd be really difficult not only to compete with fresh seafood, but with companies that are putting out a better product and in larger volumes. In 1938, the North Carolina Fisheries Incorporated had to throw out about 75% of their stock. They had problems with freezer burn. They had issues with some of their product thawing out as well, unfortunately, and the fish spoiling. And some of that fish had been sent out and upset some of the grocery stores because they were getting bad product. fisheries had to turn around and send out newer, fresher product. There's a lot of issues with quality control at the North Carolina Fisheries Incorporated, and because they didn't know how bad their stock was, they decided to just throw out most of it and start all over again from scratch, which was very expensive. Because of all these problems with marketing frozen foods and problems they were having with their freezing facilities, and cold storage, Zion Mason decided to start selling fresh fish. He wasn't freezing them, he wasn't filleting them, he was just putting fish in boxes of ice and shipping them up north to places like New York and Baltimore, places that really the wholesale fish dealers of North Carolina were doing. He was trying to cut down on the cost of processing and really trying to find different ways to maximize profits. Unfortunately, he was competing with the wholesale fish dealers by doing this, and he wasn't focused on the frozen foods, which was really what the fisheries was trying to push at the time. Then there's the issue with members just weren't selling to the co-op. And this was because they're trying to avoid repayment of loans. Mind you, it's the Great Depression. Fishermen are struggling to clothe their children and to put bread on the tables at home. And the fisheries, when the fishermen who had loans with them would bring in their catch, 10% of the value of that catch went to repaying that loan. And some of these fishermen just couldn't afford 10%, so they avoided the fisheries and were selling to other dealers. November 1938, Zion Mason was asked to resign, pretty much because he wasn't focused enough on frozen fish or frozen fillets. He was too focused on fresh seafood, and that wasn't in line with the vision of the board or the co-op. And so they decided to bring someone else in. So on November 17th, 1938, Stanley Woodland became the new manager. Stanley Woodland's an interesting figure. He'd come down from up north to Morehead City with his brother to start a wholesale fish business. When his brother died, they dissolved the business and he went to go work for the fisheries. However, he became a really upstanding member of the community in Morehead City and was very civically involved. Everyone knew this guy, and a lot of the fishermen knew and trusted him. And he had a lot of experience in wholesale fish dealing, and he was really committed to the idea of the co-op. And so he seems like the type of guy who's going to turn things around at the fisheries and try and make it profitable and make it better. So next time, we're going to go over part 6, which is 1939, the last year the fisheries is in operation, and this is going to be the last part to our series. So see you next time.